A little black boy claiming his daddy runs an empire where people pay for protection and respect. That's the most pathetic lie I've heard in 28 years of teaching. Mrs. Wilmer doesn't whisper it. She announces it to the entire second-grade class at Jefferson Elementary. Then she snatches Miles Sinclair's Career Day essay and crumples it into a ball. You don't get to invent a powerful father to impress your classmates. She throws the paper in the trash. What is he really? A janitor? A security guard? Her voice drops cold. I'm calling child services about this disturbing little fantasy. 7-year-old Miles sits frozen, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Every kid stares. Some laugh. He had written about his father the way other kids talked about superheroes. Now Mrs. Wilmer was calling him a liar for telling the truth. But in less than 1 hour, every word Miles wrote would prove true, and this classroom would go dead silent when they saw who walked through that door. If you're already hooked, hit like so more people see this story. Have you ever watched a teacher destroy a child for being black and telling the truth? 2 hours earlier, that same boy had woken up believing today would be perfect. Voices drifted from downstairs. Italian. Low and serious. Then his father's voice. Calm. Final. Cutting through everything. The Sinclair family lived in a brownstone on a tree-lined street most people never noticed. The furniture was antique. The walls held oil paintings instead of family photos. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. That was the rule. In the kitchen, Miles found his father at the marble counter in a 3-piece charcoal suit. Gold rings caught the light as he turned the page of his newspaper. His dark hair slicked back, touches of gray at the temples. His eyes were cold, until they landed on his son. Morning, little man. 3 men in black suits stood near the espresso machine. They nodded at Miles but didn't smile. Men who worked for his father never smiled. They studied the room the way predators study prey. On the refrigerator, a crayon drawing showed a stick figure in a long coat surrounded by smaller figures. My dad, written in wobbly letters. Next to it, a calendar with today circled in red. Career Day. Daddy, can I tell them about the black cars? And the men who work for you? Frank Sinclair set down his espresso. Miles. His voice was gentle but firm. Our family is different. A Sinclair doesn't prove anything to anyone. The truth speaks for itself. Miles nodded. But he didn't understand. Not really. Why did other kids get to brag about their dads while he had to stay quiet? He grabbed his plain navy backpack. No labels, no flash. His father's rule. He didn't know that in less than 3 hours, keeping quiet would become impossible. Make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss the moment this classroom goes silent. Jefferson Elementary sat where 3 worlds collided. Military families rotating through. Immigrant families chasing something better. Working-class kids whose parents cleaned buildings downtown. It was supposed to be a place where every child mattered equally. But Mrs. Wilmer had taught there for 28 years. And in those years, she'd developed a very clear sense of which children came from good families, and which ones were making things up. The banker's son? Promising? The janitor's daughter? Background noise. The quiet black boy in the back row who never talked about his home. Trouble. She had no idea that trouble was about to walk through her door in a 3-piece suit, with 4 bodyguards behind him. Miles lingered at the kitchen doorway, watching his father. Frank Sinclair didn't look up from his newspaper. But he knew. He always knew. You're still standing there, little man. Miles stepped closer. The men near the espresso machine shifted. Not threatening, just aware. They tracked everything. Entrances, exits, even a 7-year-old crossing a kitchen. Can I at least tell them you wear nice suits? Frank folded the newspaper. Set it down with the precision of a man who never rushed. His rings clicked softly against the marble. What did I say? Miles sighed. A Sinclair doesn't prove anything. Frank's lips twitched. Almost a smile. Close enough? Marco appeared at Frank's side, murmuring something about a call from downtown. Frank's expression shifted instantly, warmth draining, replaced by something harder. Colder. The father vanished. The boss emerged. Miles had seen this transformation 1,000 times. It still unsettled him. "Handle it," Frank said flatly. "I have somewhere to be this afternoon." Marco's eyebrow lifted a fraction. That was as close to surprise as he ever showed. "The school," Frank added. "Career day." Marco nodded once and disappeared into the hallway. The other men exchanged glances but said nothing. Nobody questioned Frank Sinclair. Not about business, not about his son, not about anything. Frank turned back to Miles, and just like that, the coldness melted. "Come here." Miles crossed the kitchen. His father crouched down, something he never did in front of his men, and straightened Miles's collar. His hands were gentle, the same hands that made grown men nervous. "You're going to do great today." Frank's voice was low, just for him. "And when I walk in, you hold your head high, understand?" "Yes, Daddy, that's my boy." Frank stood, checked his watch, adjusted his cufflinks. Enzo. The name landed like a command. A broad-shouldered man by the door straightened. "Yes, boss. Take my son to school. The usual route. And Enzo..." Frank's eyes darkened. "Nothing happens to him." Enzo nodded. Nothing ever would. Miles followed Enzo through the grand foyer, past the sculptures, past the security monitors disguised as picture frames, past the umbrella stand that held no umbrellas. At the front door, he paused. The brownstone's entrance opened onto a quiet street. Birds chirped. A neighbor walked a golden retriever. Normal, ordinary, safe. Behind him, a house full of secrets. Miles stepped outside. In his plain polo and scuffed sneakers, he looked like any other kid walking to a waiting car. Forgettable. Invisible. That was the point. Enzo opened the back door of a modest black sedan. Not the armored SUV, not the town car with tinted windows. Just a regular car, another layer of disguise. Miles climbed in, backpack on his lap. Today his father would walk into his classroom. Today his classmates would see the truth. He pressed his nose to the window as the car pulled away from the curb. He had no idea the truth was about to cost him everything he thought he knew. Jefferson Elementary looked like every other public school in the district. Brick walls, faded murals, a flagpole out front that had been repainted so many times the layers were peeling. But Room 4B was different. Room 4B belonged to Mrs. Wilmer. 28 years she'd taught at Jefferson. 28 years of sitting behind the same wooden desk, under the same flickering fluorescent lights, watching children come and go like seasons. Principals changed. Curriculums changed. Parents complained and moved on. Mrs. Wilmer remained. She stood at the front of the classroom that morning, silver-gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the corners of her eyes. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, lips pressed into a permanent thin line as if smiling might crack her face. She had a gift. Or so she believed. She could look at a child on the first day of school and know exactly what they'd become. Promising, or problem, winner, or waste of time. It took her less than a second to sort them. Ethan Prescott sat in the front row, center seat, blonde hair neatly combed, polo shirt with a tiny horse on the chest. His father was a vice president at First National Bank. His mother chaired the PTA. Mrs. Wilmer smiled at Ethan every morning, asked about his weekend, praised his handwriting even when it was sloppy. Ethan was promising. 2 rows back, Maria Gonzalez hunched over her desk, copying spelling words. Her mother cleaned office buildings at night. Her clothes were always clean but never new. She raised her hand often. Mrs. Wilmer rarely called on her. Maria was background noise. And then there was Miles. Back row, corner seat, the spot nearest the window where he could watch the world outside without being watched himself. He'd arrived at Jefferson 3 months ago. Quiet, polite, never caused trouble. His emergency contact form listed a father, Frank Sinclair, private business owner, and no mother. His address was in a neighborhood Mrs. Wilmer didn't recognize, which meant it was probably one of those rundown rental blocks on the east side. She'd made up her mind about Miles Sinclair the moment she saw him. Black. Fatherless, probably. Private business owner was code for unemployed. Too quiet, which meant either slow or hiding something. Either way, not worth the extra attention. Miles felt her judgment every day. The way her eyes skipped over him during roll call. The way she never complimented his work, even when it was perfect. The way she sighed whenever he raised his hand. He'd learned to stop raising it. Now he just watched, observed, kept his head down and waited for the final bell. But today was different. Today was career day. Today his father was coming. And for the first time since he'd walked into room 4B, Miles Sinclair felt something dangerous rising in his chest. Hope. Mrs. Wilmer wrote the instructions on the board in sharp, blocky letters. Career day. Essay. What does your parent do for work? Why is their job important? She underlined important twice. Around the room, pencils scratched against paper. Ethan Prescott was already on his second paragraph, writing about his father's corner office and company car. Maria Gonzalez stared at her blank page, chewing her lip, trying to make cleaning lady sound impressive. Miles held his pencil above the paper. He thought about his father. The suits, the rings, the men who appeared and disappeared at all hours. The way people spoke to Frank Sinclair. Carefully, respectfully, like one wrong word might cost them something they couldn't afford to lose. He didn't know the word for what his father did. Not really, but he knew what he saw. Miles began to write. My daddy runs a business. He paused. Thought about the men in the kitchen, the phone calls in Italian. The way his father said, protection, like it was the most natural thing in the world. People pay him for protection. His handwriting was careful, neat. He wanted his father to be proud when he read it. He makes sure everyone follows the rules. That was true, wasn't it? His father was always talking about rules, loyalty, respect, consequences for people who forgot their place. He wears nice suits and drives black cars. Miles smiled a little, picturing his father stepping out of the sedan. The way his coat swept behind him. The way people moved out of his path without being asked. He is very respected. He underlined respected the way Mrs. Wilmer had underlined important. Then he set down his pencil, satisfied. He didn't notice the shadow falling over his desk. Mrs. Wilmer stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. Her eyes moved across his words once, twice. Her lip curled like she'd smelled something rotten. Miles looked up. Smiled. That's my daddy. Mrs. Wilmer didn't smile back. She stared at him the way she might stare at a stain on her carpet. Something unpleasant. Something that needed to be dealt with. Protection, she repeated slowly. Drives black cars. Makes sure everyone follows the rules. Yes, ma'am. He nodded eagerly. He's coming today. You'll get to meet him. Mrs. Wilmer's jaw tightened. She'd seen essays like this before. Boys from broken homes inventing fantasy fathers, gang members, drug dealers, criminals dressed up in a child's imagination as businessmen. This boy, this quiet black boy from God knows where, was spinning fairy tales, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. She walked back to her desk without a word. But Miles saw it. The look. The decision forming behind her glasses. He didn't understand what it meant. Not yet. He just went back to admiring his essay, proud of every word. Career day began at 9 o'clock sharp. Mrs. Wilmer sat at her desk like a queen on a throne, clipboard in hand, ready to judge. Ethan Prescott went first. Of course he did. He strode to the front of the room with the confidence of a boy who'd never been told no. His poster board showed photos of his father in a glass office, shaking hands with men in expensive suits. My dad is a vice president at First National Bank. He manages over $50 million in assets. He drives a Mercedes and plays golf with the mayor. Mrs. Wilmer beamed. Wonderful, Ethan. Simply wonderful. Your father must be so proud of you. Ethan grinned and returned to his seat like a champion. Maria Gonzalez went next. She shuffled to the front, poster board trembling in her hands. No photos, just words written in careful marker. My mom... She cleared her throat. My mom cleans offices at night. She works really hard so I can have lunch money and new shoes for school. Her voice cracked. She looked at Mrs. Wilmer, hoping for something. A nod. A smile. Anything. Mrs. Wilmer glanced at the clock. Thank you, Maria. Next. Maria walked back to her seat with her head down. Then Mrs. Wilmer's eyes found Miles. Miles Sinclair. You're up. Miles stood. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. He walked to the front of the room, essay clutched against his chest. No poster board, just his words. He began to read. My daddy runs a business. People pay him for protection. He makes sure everyone follows the rules. He wears nice suits and drives black cars. He is very respected. Laughter rippled through the room. Miles kept reading. My daddy is the most powerful man I know. When he walks into a room, everyone listens. He's coming today, so you can... That's enough. Mrs. Wilmer's voice sliced through the air like a knife. Sit down, Miles. But I'm not finished. She crossed the room in 3 steps, snatched the paper from his hands. Her eyes scanned the words, and her face twisted with disgust. She turned to the class, holding up his essay like evidence of a crime. Listen to this. People pay him for protection? She laughed coldly. He makes sure everyone follows the rules. She shook her head. This isn't an essay. This is a fantasy. A lie. She crumpled the paper into a ball. We don't reward lies in this classroom. The paper landed in the trash can with a soft thud. Miles stood frozen, his vision blurred. Heat crawled up his neck, into his face. Tears filled his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. His voice came out quiet. Steady. My daddy is coming today, Mrs. Wilmer smirked. You'll see. The walk to the front office felt like a funeral march. Miles kept his head down as Mrs. Wilmer's hand gripped his shoulder, steering him through the hallway like a prisoner. Other classrooms blurred past. Other kids stared through door windows. He didn't look up. Not once. Mrs. Wilmer deposited him in a plastic chair outside Vice Principal Thornton's office and disappeared without a word. The secretary glanced at Miles, then back at her computer. She'd seen this before. Kids in trouble. Kids waiting to be judged. 10 minutes passed. The door finally opened. Vice Principal Thornton was a thin man with a receding hairline and glasses that sat crooked on his nose. His shirt was wrinkled. His tie was loose. Everything about him screamed, I don't want problems. Miles Sinclair? He checked his clipboard. Come in. The office smelled like stale coffee and old paper. Thornton settled behind his desk, opened a manila folder, and frowned at whatever he saw inside. So, he adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Wilmer says you wrote a disturbing essay. Miles said nothing. Thornton flipped a page. Guardian. Frank Sinclair. Occupation. Private business owner. He looked up. What exactly does your father do, Miles? He runs a business. What kind of business? Miles hesitated. People pay him for protection and respect. Thornton's frown deepened. He'd heard this before, too. Fathers who were entrepreneurs. Fathers who had private businesses. Code words for unemployment, or worse. "Miles," he said slowly, "Mrs. Wilmer is concerned about your home life. The things you wrote, protection, rules, black cars, it sounds like maybe you're confused about what your father actually does." "I'm not confused." Thornton leaned back, rubbed his temples. "I'm going to have to make some calls." He reached for the phone. "Child Protective Services might need to... My daddy is coming." Thornton paused. "Excuse me?" "Today. For career day." Miles's voice was steady, but his hands trembled under the desk. "He's coming. You'll see." Thornton stared at him for a long moment, then sighed the sigh of a man who didn't have time for this. "We'll see about that." He turned to his computer and began typing. Miles's hand slipped into his pocket. His fingers found his phone, the one his father had given him for emergencies. He wasn't supposed to check it at school. He checked it anyway. One new message. He tilted the screen just enough to read it. "Leaving now. 20 minutes." Miles's heart slammed against his ribs. He slid the phone back into his pocket and looked up at Vice Principal Thornton, still typing his report, still preparing to call child services, still convinced that Miles Sinclair was just another troubled kid from a broken home. 20 minutes. Miles folded his hands in his lap. He could wait. The classroom fell silent when Mrs. Wilmer marched Miles back through the door. Every head turned, every eye watched. Miles kept his gaze forward. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Mrs. Wilmer positioned him at the front of the room like a defendant awaiting sentencing. She stood beside him, arms crossed, chin lifted. "Class," she announced, "Miles has something he'd like to say." Miles blinked. "No, I don't." Mrs. Wilmer's smile tightened. She leaned down, close enough that only he could hear. "I'm giving you a chance," she whispered. "One chance. Apologize for lying. Tell the class you made up that ridiculous story about your father. Do that, and we can forget this whole thing." Miles looked at her. Really looked. He saw the certainty in her eyes, the absolute conviction that she was right, and he was wrong. She didn't just think he was lying, she needed him to be lying. Because if he wasn't, then she had made a terrible mistake, and Mrs. Wilmer didn't make mistakes. "Well?" She straightened up. "We're waiting." The classroom held its breath. Miles thought about his father, the way he carried himself, the lessons he taught without ever raising his voice. A Sinclair doesn't beg. A Sinclair doesn't bend. He opened his mouth. "My daddy said a man who apologizes for the truth is no man at all." The words landed like stones in still water. Mrs. Wilmer's face went red, then white. Her hands trembled at her sides. "Fine." Her voice was ice. "You want to play this game?" "We'll play." She pointed to the corner of the room, the spot near the trash can, where the broken crayons and forgotten papers ended up. "Sit there. Don't move. Don't speak." She smiled, a cruel, satisfied smile. "We'll wait for your businessman daddy together, and when he doesn't show up, you'll apologize in front of everyone." Miles walked to the corner. He sat down on the cold tile floor, back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. Behind him, the whispers started. "Did you hear what he wrote? Protection money, like a gangster. My mom says kids like him end up in juvie." Giggles, snickers, the sound of children who smelled weakness. Miles stared at the clock above the door. The second hand ticked. 1 minute, 2, 5. Mrs. Wilmer returned to her desk, smug and satisfied, already composing the email to child services in her head. The other students returned to their career day presentations, casting glances at the boy in the corner like he was a zoo exhibit. Miles didn't move. He just watched the clock. 15 minutes left. His father always kept his word. Always. The convoy appeared at exactly 9:47 a.m. 3 black SUVs, windows tinted so dark they reflected the morning sky like obsidian mirrors. They rolled into the Jefferson Elementary parking lot in perfect formation. Slow, deliberate, inevitable. Mrs. Patterson, the third-grade teacher, was the first to notice. She stopped mid-sentence, chalk frozen against the board, and stared out the window. What in the world? Other teachers noticed, too. Heads turned, lessons paused. Children pressed their faces against glass, watching the strange procession like it was a scene from a movie. The SUVs stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. 4 men emerged first. Massive, shoulders like concrete, black suits perfectly tailored. They moved with military precision, spreading out, scanning the parking lot, the entrance, the windows. Their eyes missed nothing. One of them spoke into his wrist. Clear. Principal Hayes was on her second cup of coffee when her phone rang. Yes? She listened. Her face changed. The color drained from her cheeks like water from a sink. I'm sorry. Who? She listened again. Associates? What do you mean, associates? She stood up so fast her chair rolled into the wall. Through her office window, she saw them. The men in black, the SUVs. And then, stepping out of the middle vehicle, a figure that made her blood turn cold. Frank Sinclair moved like smoke. Tall, immaculate, a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than her annual salary. A long overcoat that swept behind him like a shadow. Dark hair slicked back, silver at the temples. Gold rings catching the light. But it was his face that stopped her. Calm. Completely, utterly calm. The kind of calm that came from absolute certainty. The kind of calm that made powerful men nervous and smart men terrified. He adjusted his cufflinks as he walked. Unhurried. Like he owned the ground beneath his feet. The front doors of Jefferson Elementary swung open. The 4 men entered first, flanking the hallway, backs against walls, hands clasped in front of them. Students froze. Teachers stepped back. The secretary behind the front desk dropped her coffee mug. Frank Sinclair stepped through. He paused, looked around. Let the silence settle. Then he spoke. Room 4B. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The secretary's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Sir, do you have, you need to sign in. Frank turned his head. Just slightly. Just enough to look at her. She stopped talking. Room 4B, he repeated. My son's classroom. End of the hall, her voice came out as a whisper. On the right. Frank nodded once. Then he walked. His men followed. Their footsteps echoed through the silent hallway like a countdown. And in room 4B, Mrs. Wilmer had no idea her world was about to collapse. The door to room 4B swung open. Not slowly. Not politely. It swung wide and stayed there, like the room itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Wilmer had been mid-sentence, pointing at Tommy Richards, scolding him for whispering. Her finger froze in the air. Her mouth hung open. The children who had been giggling went silent. The ones who had been mocking Miles turned to stone. 4 men entered first. They didn't speak, didn't introduce themselves. They simply moved to the 4 corners of the classroom and stood there, hands clasped, eyes forward, utterly immovable. Like statues, like soldiers, like something out of a nightmare. Then Frank Sinclair stepped through the door. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting them see him. The suit, the coat, the rings, the face of a man who had never begged for anything in his life. His eyes swept the room. They found Mrs. Wilmer first, held her. measured her. Then they found his son. Miles sat in the corner, knees to his chest, back against the wall, the spot reserved for broken crayons and forgotten things. Something flickered in Frank's eyes, something dangerous. He walked. Each footstep echoed like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate. The children shrank back as he passed. Even Ethan Prescott, golden boy, banker's son, pressed himself against his chair like he wanted to disappear. Frank reached the corner. He crouched down, placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Miles looked up. His eyes were red but dry. He hadn't cried. He hadn't broken. Frank's voice was soft. Just for him. "I'm here." Miles exhaled. Every muscle in his small body released at once. Frank stood, turned, and faced Mrs. Wilmer. She hadn't moved. Couldn't move. Her finger still pointed at nothing, trembling now. Frank walked toward her, stopped 3 feet away. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. That made it worse. "You called my son a liar." Mrs. Wilmer's lips moved. No sound came out. "You destroyed his work. You humiliated him in front of his peers. I didn't—" Frank stepped closer. "I am Frank Sinclair. I do run a business. People do pay me for protection. And I am very—" He paused. Let the silence stretch. "Very respected." Mrs. Wilmer's face went white, then gray. Her hands shook against her desk. "Now." Frank's voice dropped even lower. "You're going to apologize to my son. And you're going to mean it." Tears spilled down Mrs. Wilmer's cheeks. Her voice came out broken. "I'm sorry." She looked at Miles. "I'm so sorry." Frank studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. He turned to the class. Every child sat rigid, terrified, mesmerized. Let this be a lesson. His voice carried to every corner. Never assume you know someone's story by looking at them. Assumptions make fools of everyone. He extended his hand. Miles took it. "Come, son. We're done here." 3 weeks later, room 4B had a new teacher. Nobody talked about what happened to Mrs. Wilmer. Not officially. The district newsletter simply announced she'd been transferred to administrative duties. A polite way of saying she'd been buried in a basement office where she'd never face another child again. Principal Hayes resigned the following Monday. Health reasons, they said. Stress. Jefferson Elementary quietly implemented something called cultural sensitivity training. Teachers sat through workshops about implicit bias and assumptions. They nodded along, took notes, pretended they hadn't all heard what happened in room 4B, but they had. Everyone had. The story spread through the district like wildfire. A little black boy, a teacher who called him a liar, and the father who walked in with 4 bodyguards and brought the whole school to its knees. Nobody said the word Mafia. Nobody had to. Miles returned to school a week after the incident. The other kids treated him differently now, not with cruelty, with caution. They didn't mock him anymore. They didn't laugh. They stepped aside when he walked down the hallway. He wasn't sure if that was better or worse. 3 weeks to the day, Miles sat in his father's study. The room smelled like leather and old books. Oak shelves lined the walls. A single lamp cast golden light across Frank Sinclair's desk, where he stood pouring amber liquid into a crystal glass. Miles watched from the corner of the sofa, legs tucked beneath him. "Daddy?" Frank glanced over his shoulder. "Yeah, little man?" Miles hesitated. The question had been building inside him for weeks, growing heavier each day. "Why was she so scared of you?" Frank's hand paused over the glass. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he set down the bottle, walked over, sat beside his son on the leather sofa. The cushion dipped under his weight. "Because some people only understand power, Miles. His voice was quiet, thoughtful. And power has a price. Miles frowned. What kind of price? Frank looked at him. Really looked. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that made grown men tremble, softened. You told the truth. You should never be ashamed of that. He placed a hand on Miles's knee. But the world your truth comes from, it's complicated. Someday you'll understand. Miles nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand. Not yet. But he looked at his father. The rings, the suit, the scars on his knuckles he never explained, and he felt the weight of something he couldn't name. Love, fear, pride, uncertainty. All of it, tangled together. Frank squeezed his knee, then stood and returned to his drink. Miles stayed on the sofa, watching the lamplight flicker across his father's back. He'd learned something that day in room 4B, something that would stay with him forever. The truth will set you free. But sometimes, the truth walks into a room with 4 bodyguards, and freedom looks an awful lot like fear.